The Ellsworth estate sprawled over several acres in Connecticut, its grand architecture and manicured gardens a testament to the kind of wealth most people only dreamed of. But behind the marble walls and towering columns of the estate lay a different truth. It was a home bereft of warmth, where silence often said more than words ever could. Victor Ellsworth, at 47 years old, was a man of immense power and influence. A self-made billionaire in the world of technology, he had built an empire from the ground up, transforming how governments and corporations handled security and data. To the outside world, Victor was a symbol of success, a man who could bend markets and mold innovation to his will. Yet, for all his accomplishments, his personal life was a glaring void. Victor's wife, Helena, had been his emotional anchor, the one person who had kept him grounded amid his relentless pursuit of greatness. Her sudden death 5 years ago in a car accident had left him hollow. Helena's absence was a wound that never fully healed, and it widened the chasm between Victor and his son, Liam, now 19 years old. Where once there had been laughter and camaraderie, there was now only bitterness and distance. Liam, a freshman at a prestigious university in New York, had inherited his father's sharp intellect, but not his relentless drive. Where Victor saw work as a means to control the chaos of life, Liam viewed it as a chain that shackled his mother's spirit and ultimately led to her untimely death. To him, Victor's empire was a gilded prison, one that robbed them of the family they could have been. Liam had been only 14 when Helena died. The last memory he had of his mother was of her smiling sadly at him as she prepared to leave the house for a charity event, a tense conversation with Victor lingering in the air. The next thing he knew, she was gone, a crash on Route 42 taking her life and leaving unanswered questions in its wake. Victor had grieved in his own way, retreating into his work, but for Liam, it felt like his father was simply running away. The growing distance between father and son was not just emotional but also ideological. Victor believed in action, control, and sacrifice, no matter the cost. Liam believed in transparency, empathy, and justice, ideals he felt his father had abandoned long ago. Their conversations, when they happened, were brief and strained, often devolving into thinly veiled arguments. It was a stormy evening in October when the cracks in their fragile relationship were shattered for good. Victor had invited Liam home for a rare family dinner, an attempt to bridge the growing divide. The dining room was a portrait of luxury, the crystal chandelier casting a warm glow over the polished mahogany table. Victor, in his crisp tailored suit, looked every bit the powerful man he was, but there was an unease in his movements, a hesitation as he tried to connect with his son. Liam sat across from him, his disheveled hair and casual hoodie a stark contrast to the room's opulence. He picked at his food, his expression a mix of boredom and simmering resentment. "Liam," Victor began, his voice steady but strained, "I know things haven't been easy between us, especially since your mother." "Don't," Liam interrupted, his tone sharp. "Don't bring Mom into this. You don't get to play the grieving husband when you barely even cared when she was alive." Victor flinched as if struck. "That's not true," he said quietly. "I cared about your mother more than you know. Everything I've done was for her, for you." "For me?" Liam laughed bitterly. "All you've ever done is hide behind your work and your money. Do you even realize what that did to her? She was miserable, Dad. She felt like she didn't matter to you. And then his voice broke, and he looked away, his hands trembling. Victor opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by the sudden arrival of his assistant, Karen. She stepped into the room, her expression pale and anxious. "Mr. Ellsworth," she said, her voice urgent, "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's an issue with the foundation. The auditors have flagged something serious." Victor frowned, his attention shifting immediately. "What kind of issue?" Karen hesitated, glancing at Liam. Perhaps we should discuss this privately. No, Liam said, standing up. Let me guess, another scandal you're trying to sweep under the rug. What is it this time? Tax evasion? Embezzlement? Liam, that's enough, Victor snapped, his patience wearing thin. Karen's voice broke through the tension. It's worse than that. There's been an anonymous tip to the authorities. They're accusing you of misappropriating funds from the veterans' charity. For a moment, the room was silent. Then Liam let out a hollow laugh. Of course. Why am I not surprised? The great Victor Ellsworth stealing from veterans. Is this what you meant when you said you were doing it for us? Victor stood, his face a mask of controlled anger. I would never do such a thing. You know that. Do I? Liam shot back. Honestly, Dad, I don't know anything about you anymore. Before Victor could respond, the sound of sirens echoed through the estate. A squad of police cars pulled up outside, their flashing lights casting eerie patterns against the mansion's walls. Moments later, officers entered the house, their presence heavy and commanding. Victor Ellsworth, one of them announced, "You're under arrest for embezzlement and fraud. You have the right to remain silent." The room erupted into chaos. Karen tried to argue with the officers, but Victor raised a hand to stop her. He turned to Liam, his eyes searching for something understanding, perhaps, or forgiveness, but found only cold detachment. As the officers led him away in handcuffs, Liam stood rooted to the spot, watching his father's downfall with a mixture of disbelief and vindication. "Good luck, Dad," he muttered under his breath, the words heavy with sarcasm. "You're gonna need it." The last thing Victor saw as he was pushed into the back of the police car was his son's face, a storm of anger and pain that mirrored his own. The courtroom was packed with reporters, lawyers, and a few curious onlookers who had managed to sneak past security. The case of Victor Ellsworth, a man celebrated as a tech visionary and philanthropist, was unfolding into a public spectacle. The prosecution wasted no time painting him as a cold, calculating figure who had allegedly funneled millions from a veterans' charity into offshore accounts. Every detail, from the lavish trips to his questionable financial records, was meticulously laid out. Liam Ellsworth sat in the gallery, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his jaw clenched. He hadn't planned to come, but something about seeing his father brought low drew him there. The man who had always seemed untouchable now sat at the defense table, his once imposing figure looking smaller somehow. It was the first time Liam had seen his father show vulnerability, but instead of pity, all he could feel was anger. "Mr. Ellsworth," the prosecutor said, pacing slowly across the courtroom floor, "is it not true that you were the sole decision-maker for the Ellsworth Foundation? That every transaction, every allocation of funds, ultimately required your approval?" Victor leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. His voice, though calm, was tinged with frustration. "Yes, I oversee all major decisions for the foundation, but I would never misappropriate funds. That money was meant for the people we serve, and I've devoted my life to ensuring it reaches them." And yet, the prosecutor continued, "We have evidence that millions of dollars were transferred from the foundation's account to a series of shell companies, all tied back to you." Victor's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. His lawyer, an older man with sharp eyes, stood. "Objection, Your Honor. The prosecution is making speculative leaps without concrete proof of Mr. Ellsworth's involvement." "Overruled," the judge replied, his gavel tapping lightly against the wooden desk. In the back of the courtroom, Liam shifted uncomfortably. He didn't know what to believe anymore. He wanted to think his father was innocent, but the evidence felt damning, and Victor's stoic demeanor only fueled Liam's suspicion that he was hiding something. After the hearing adjourned for the day, Liam made his way toward the exit, hoping to leave unnoticed. But as he approached the large glass doors, A sharp voice stopped him. "Liam." He turned to see Karen, his father's assistant, hurrying toward him, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with urgency. "I've been trying to call you," she said, slightly out of breath. "Victor didn't want me to reach out, but you need to hear this." Liam frowned, stepping aside to let other people pass. "If you're here to convince me to support him, don't bother. I'm not going to defend someone who—" Karen interrupted him, lowering her voice. "It's not about that. It's about the foundation. There's something off. Some of the financial discrepancies. Victor's signature is on those documents. Yes, but he's adamant he didn't sign them. He thinks someone forged his approval." Liam's skepticism flared. Of course he'd say that. He's just trying to cover his tracks. Karen's expression hardened. "I've worked for your father for over 10 years. I know when he's lying, and I know when he's telling the truth. Right now he's terrified. Not for himself, but for the foundation and for you." "For me?" Liam scoffed. "What does this have to do with me?" Karen hesitated, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. "You remember those documents you used to play with when you were a kid? The ones your mother kept in the library?" Liam froze. He hadn't thought about that in years. As a child, he'd loved doodling on the back of papers he found in his mother's study, not realizing they were important. He remembered how she'd always scold him gently, saying, "Liam, these aren't just scraps. These are your father's work." "What about them?" he asked, his voice cautious. Karen stepped closer, lowering her voice further. "Some of those documents were contracts for the foundation, ones that had your father's name on them. The ones you drew on were missing for years, and now they're suddenly part of the prosecution's evidence. Victor doesn't think it's a coincidence." The words hit Liam like a punch to the gut. His mind raced. Could it really be possible that those old papers, the ones he'd barely paid attention to as a child, were now being used against his father? And if so, how had they resurfaced? "Why are you telling me this?" Liam asked, his voice tight. Karen's expression softened. "Because I think someone's trying to frame your father, and I think they're using you to do it." That night, Liam sat in his dorm room, staring blankly at his laptop screen. His roommate had gone out, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Karen's words echoed in his mind, colliding with memories of his mother, his childhood, and the deep resentment he'd carried for so long. He opened a folder on his desk, one he hadn't touched in years. Inside were old photographs of his family, including one of him as a child, sitting at a desk covered in papers. His mother stood behind him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. She was smiling, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes, a look he hadn't noticed until now. Liam's heart ached. He didn't want to believe Karen, but a part of him knew she was right. Something wasn't adding up, and if there was even a chance that his father was innocent, he owed it to his mother's memory to find the truth. The next morning, Liam attended the hearing again, this time with a different perspective. As he watched the prosecution present more damning evidence, he couldn't help but scrutinize every detail. When they displayed the contracts allegedly signed by Victor, his breath caught in his throat. The signatures looked identical to his father's, but something was off. They lacked the slight curve at the end of the H of the earth, a quirk Liam had noticed when his father used to sign birthday cards for his mother. After the hearing, Liam approached Victor for the first time in years. His father looked exhausted, the weight of the trial bearing down on him. "Liam," Victor said, his voice hoarse, "what are you doing here?" "I need to ask you something," Liam said, his tone cautious. "The documents they showed in court today, are you absolutely sure you didn't sign them?" Victor's eyes softened, and for a moment, Liam saw a glimpse of the man his mother used to talk about, the man who had once been warm and full of life. I swear to you, Victor said, his voice steady, I didn't sign those papers. Whoever did this, they want to destroy everything I've built. Liam studied his father's face, searching for any hint of deception. But all he saw was pain and desperation. For the first time, doubt crept into Liam's mind. Could he have been wrong about his father all along? The gallery in the courtroom had grown even more crowded, with journalists lining the walls and the faint hum of whispers filling the air. The trial of Victor Ellsworth was no longer just a legal battle, it had become a media circus, a public dismantling of a once revered titan. Every detail of Victor's life was now on display, his past business ventures, the veterans' charity, and even his strained relationship with his son. Liam sat in the gallery, his mind a whirlwind of doubt and confusion. For years, he had believed his father to be nothing more than a man consumed by ambition, a cold, unfeeling figure who had allowed work to take precedence over his family. But now, with Karen's revelation about the forged documents and his own realization about the signatures, cracks had begun to form in his certainty. If Victor was innocent, who was behind the frame-up and why? The prosecution introduced a new witness that morning, Alan Grant, a former financial advisor to the Ellsworth Foundation, and a man whose testimony carried significant weight. Alan stepped onto the stand, his demeanor calm but with a faint edge of arrogance that made Liam bristle. Mr. Grant, the prosecutor began, can you tell the court about your role within the Ellsworth Foundation? Certainly, Alan replied, his voice smooth and measured. I was responsible for overseeing the allocation of funds, ensuring that donations were used effectively and in accordance with the Foundation's mission. I worked closely with Mr. Ellsworth to review major transactions. And in your time working with Mr. Ellsworth, did you ever notice any irregularities? Alan hesitated, a deliberate pause that seemed designed to heighten the tension in the room. Yes, he said finally. On several occasions, I raised concerns about certain transfers that didn't align with our standard protocols. When I brought these to Mr. Ellsworth's attention, he assured me they were above board, but he refused to provide further details. Victor's lawyer stood immediately. Objection, Your Honor. This is conjecture, not evidence. The judge nodded. Sustained. The witness will refrain from making speculative statements. Alan shifted in his seat, his lips curling into a faint smirk. Of course, Your Honor. Let me clarify, I've documented evidence of these irregular transfers, including emails from Mr. Ellsworth directing me to approve them. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Liam felt his stomach churn. This was the kind of testimony that could destroy Victor's case. That evening, Liam left the courtroom with a heavy heart. The image of Alan sitting smugly on the witness stand haunted him, and the questions in his mind only multiplied. He returned to his dorm, hoping for clarity, but instead found Karen waiting for him outside the building. Karen, he said, surprised, what are you doing here? She gestured for him to follow her to a quieter corner. I didn't want to say this at the courthouse, she began, but there's something you need to see. Something that might change everything. Liam followed her reluctantly, his skepticism growing. Karen led him to a nearby cafe, where she pulled a tablet from her bag and set it on the table between them. On the screen was an email exchange between Alan Grant and an anonymous third party. The messages were encrypted, but the snippets that Karen had managed to decode were damning. Look at this, she said, pointing to a particular line. The plan is in motion. Once Ellsworth is out of the picture, the funds will be rerouted. Liam leaned back in his chair, a cold sense of dread washing over him. Where did you get this? I've been digging into Alan's records ever since Victor mentioned his suspicions, Karen explained. He's been quietly siphoning money from the foundation for years, using offshore accounts and fake charities to cover his tracks. He's the one who set up those shell companies, not your father. Liam's mind raced. If what Karen was saying was true, then Alan was the mastermind behind the entire scheme. But how could they prove it? And why would Alan go to such lengths to frame Victor? As if reading his thoughts, Karen added, "There's more. Alan wasn't just a financial advisor, he was your father's closest confidant for years. He knew everything about the foundation, including its vulnerabilities. If anyone could pull this off, it's him." Liam's anger flared. "So why hasn't my father said anything? Why hasn't he exposed Alan?" Karen hesitated, her expression troubled. "Because Alan has leverage, something he's been holding over Victor for years." Determined to uncover the truth, Liam decided to confront Victor directly. He visited the detention center where his father was being held, his emotions a volatile mix of anger, frustration, and curiosity. Victor looked up as Liam entered the room, his expression softening at the sight of his son. "Liam," Victor said, his voice weary but warm, "I wasn't expecting you." Liam sat across from him, his gaze steady. "I need answers, Dad. About Alan. About the foundation. About Mom." Victor's face darkened at the mention of Helena. "What do you want to know?" "Karen showed me the emails," Liam said bluntly. "She thinks Alan is behind all of this, that he's framing you. But she also said he has leverage over you. What is it, Dad? What's he holding over your head?" Victor sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's complicated, Liam. There are things you don't understand, things I've tried to protect you from." "I'm not a kid anymore," Liam shot back. "I deserve to know the truth." For a moment, Victor said nothing. Then, with visible reluctance, he began to speak. "Your mother's death wasn't an accident." Liam froze, his breath catching in his throat. "What are you talking about?" Victor's voice was heavy with guilt. "Helena, she discovered discrepancies in the Foundation's accounts years ago. She confronted Alan about it, and he threatened her. She told me everything, but before we could act, she died." Liam stared at his father, his mind reeling. "You think Alan had something to do with it?" "I don't know," Victor admitted, his voice cracking. "But I've always suspected. And now, with everything that's happening, I'm certain he's pulling the strings." Liam's hands clenched into fists. The idea that his mother's death might have been orchestrated, and that his father had kept it from him, filled him with rage. Fueled by anger and a newfound determination, Liam decided to take matters into his own hands. He began digging into Alan's connections, using every resource he could find. What he uncovered painted a chilling picture, a web of corruption that extended far beyond the Foundation, implicating powerful figures in politics and business. One night, while poring over old records in the library of his dorm, Liam stumbled upon something unexpected, a handwritten note from his mother, tucked between the pages of an old book. The note was brief but haunting. "Liam, if you ever find this, it means I didn't finish what I started. Trust your instincts, and never trust Alan." The note confirmed everything Liam had feared. His mother had known the truth, and it had cost her her life. But now, it was up to him to finish what she couldn't. The Ellsworth case was no longer a courtroom drama, it had spiraled into a national obsession. Every news channel buzzed with updates about the trial, with reporters analyzing Victor's every word, every gesture, every hesitation. Conspiracy theories abounded, from accusations that Victor had been sabotaging charities for years to claims that he was a scapegoat in a larger political game. But amid the noise, Liam found himself haunted by one thought: his mother's death was no accident. Sitting alone in his dorm room late one night, Liam replayed his father's words over and over. Helena discovered discrepancies in the Foundation's accounts. The sentence was a hammer blow, shattering the narrative he'd clung to for years. He had blamed Victor for everything: their family's dysfunction, his mother's unhappiness, even her death. But what if the truth was more complicated? What if Victor hadn't been the villain Liam had imagined him to be? What if he had been trying to protect her? The handwritten note Liam had found in the library lingered in his mind like a whisper from the past. Trust your instincts. Never trust Alan. It was more than just a warning, it was a challenge. Helena had been trying to uncover the truth, and now that responsibility had fallen to Liam. But where to begin? Karen had mentioned leverage, something Alan had been holding over Victor for years. It had to be connected to the foundation, but Liam suspected it went even deeper. There was one place where he might find answers: the Ellsworth estate. It had been months since he'd set foot in the sprawling Connecticut mansion, but he knew it still held secrets, shadows of the life he had left behind. He arrived at the estate late the next evening, the house looming against the darkened sky like a relic of another world. Inside, the air was heavy with silence, broken only by the faint creak of the floorboards under his feet. Memories flooded back as he wandered through the rooms, his mother laughing softly as she read to him by the fireplace, his father's sharp voice echoing through the halls during tense phone calls. The contrast was jarring, a reminder of how love and ambition had always been at war in this house. Liam made his way to his mother's old study, a room that had been left untouched since her death. Dust coated the bookshelves, and the faint scent of her favorite lavender candle lingered in the air. He began searching through the drawers of her desk, methodically sifting through papers, notebooks, and letters. Most of it was unremarkable grocery lists, notes about charity events, but then he found something that made his breath catch. It was a list, handwritten in Helena's precise script, titled Route 42. Beneath the heading were a series of dates and names, many of which were unfamiliar to Liam. But one name stood out: Alan Grant. The final entry was dated just a week before her death, followed by a single, chilling word: proof. Liam stared at the page, his mind racing. Route 42 wasn't just the road where his mother's car had crashed. It was connected to something much bigger, something she had been investigating. But what kind of proof had she found? And why had she been meeting with Alan so close to the end? Determined to dig deeper, Liam searched through the rest of the study. In a hidden compartment of the desk, he found an old USB drive, tucked away as if Helena had deliberately hidden it. He plugged it into his laptop, half expecting it to be empty, but instead, it contained a single video file. The video was grainy, recorded on what appeared to be a hidden camera. It showed Alan Grant sitting in an office, speaking to someone off-screen. Liam strained to make out the conversation, but one phrase stood out clearly: "If Helena keeps digging, she'll regret it. Victor can't protect her forever." Liam felt his chest tighten. This was the proof his mother had been gathering. Alan had been plotting against Victor all along, and his mother had paid the price for getting too close to the truth. But why? What was Alan's endgame? The answer came to him suddenly, like a flash of lightning. The foundation. The charity had always been Alan's way in, his means of manipulating Victor and siphoning funds. Helena must have uncovered the scheme and confronted Alan, forcing him to take drastic measures to silence her. And now, years later, Alan was using the same strategy to destroy Victor completely. Liam's hands trembled as he copied the video file onto his phone. He needed to confront Alan, but he couldn't do it alone. For the first time in years, he realized he needed his father. The next morning, Liam visited Victor in the detention center, his resolve stealing with every step. Victor looked up as Liam entered, surprise flickering across his face. "Liam," he said, his voice weary, "what are you doing here?" Liam sat down across from him, his gaze unwavering. "I found something," he said simply. Victor's expression shifted, a mixture of curiosity and caution. "What is it?" Liam took a deep breath, then slid his phone across the table. "Watch this." Victor picked up the phone, his brow furrowing as the video played. Liam watched his father's face carefully, noting the way his jaw tightened and his hands clenched into fists. When the video ended, Victor set the phone down slowly, his eyes meeting Liam's. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice low. "In Mom's study," Liam replied. "She knew, Dad. She knew Alan was up to something, and she tried to stop him. That's why his voice trailed off, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. Victor leaned back in his chair, his expression haunted. "I always suspected," he admitted. "But without proof, I couldn't do anything." And after she died, he shook his head, his voice breaking. "I failed her, Liam. I failed both of you." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Liam leaned forward, his voice firm. "We're not done yet. Alan thinks he's won, but we can still expose him. We can still finish what Mom started." Victor looked at his son, a flicker of hope returning to his eyes. "How?" Liam hesitated, then said, "The list." She left a list in her study, names, dates, something about Route 42. "I don't know what it all means yet, but it's connected. We just need to figure out how." Victor nodded slowly, his mind already working. If Alan's involved, he won't stop until he gets what he wants. But if we can trace the money, connect the dots, we might be able to corner him. Liam felt a spark of determination ignite within him. For the first time, he and his father were working together, united by a common goal. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. As they planned their next move, Liam couldn't help but think of his mother. Her voice echoed in his mind, "Trust your instincts." He didn't know how the story would end, but he was determined to honor her memory, no matter the cost. The night was suffocatingly quiet as Liam stared out the window of Karen's car. The evidence they had stolen from the storage unit was crammed into a single bag in his lap, its weight feeling more like a bomb than a lifeline. His hands trembled slightly, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins after narrowly escaping the two men who had shown up at the storage facility. Karen drove in focused silence, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. The gravel road beneath them gave way to smooth asphalt as they sped away from Route 42, but Liam's mind was anything but smooth. It churned with fragments of what they had just uncovered, haunted by questions that no one had answered. Why had Alan been moving money through this storage unit? How deep did his scheme go? And more importantly, how had this all connected to his mother's death? Liam clutched the bag tightly, his jaw clenched. It wasn't just about clearing his father's name anymore. This was about Helena. Everything, the trial, the lies, the years of guilt came back to her. Her face swam into his mind, that sad, knowing smile she used to give him when she thought he wasn't looking. She had known something. She had fought for something. And now, years later, Liam had to finish what she started. Karen broke the silence first, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "We can't go back to the city tonight. Not yet." She glanced at him, her face lit only by the dim glow of the dashboard. "Alan has people everywhere. If those guys at the storage unit report back to him, he'll be looking for us." Liam nodded absently, his gaze still fixed on the darkness outside. "What about the documents?" he asked, his voice low. "We need to show them to the lawyers, to the court." "We will," Karen said firmly, "but not until we've gone through them ourselves. If we don't understand what we're dealing with, Alan will tear the evidence apart before it even reaches a judge. He's been in this game a lot longer than you or me." Liam didn't respond. He hated the idea of waiting, of stalling while Alan continued to weave his web of lies. But Karen was right. Rushing into this would only give Alan the upper hand, and they couldn't afford to make mistakes now, not when they were so close. His thoughts drifted back to the storage unit, to the files they had grabbed in their frantic escape. Some of the names on those ledgers were familiar, names he had seen on the list his mother had left behind. It was all connected, he was sure of it. He just didn't know how. Karen pulled into the parking lot of a small roadside motel, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't seen renovations since the 1970s. The neon sign above the office flickered weakly, casting jagged shadows across the lot. She turned off the engine and looked at Liam. "We'll go through the documents here. Lay low for the night." Liam followed her into the cramped motel room, the smell of mildew hitting him the moment the door opened. It wasn't much: a single bed, a battered desk, and a TV that probably didn't work, but it would have to do. Karen dumped the bag of documents onto the bed and began sorting through them with methodical precision. Liam joined her, his earlier exhaustion forgotten in the face of the task ahead. Hours passed as they pored over the papers, piecing together a timeline of Alan's activities. The ledgers were meticulous, listing every transaction with cold, clinical efficiency. Liam's frustration grew as the picture became clearer. Alan had been siphoning money from the Ellsworth Foundation for years, funneling it through shell companies and offshore accounts. But it wasn't just about the money. Some of the transactions were marked with cryptic notes: Project Horizon, Route 42 shipment, Helena meeting. Liam's heart sank every time he saw his mother's name. She had been a threat to Alan's scheme, and he had silenced her to protect himself. "This is insane," Liam muttered, shoving a stack of papers aside. "How did no one catch this? How did my dad not catch this?" Alan was smart, Karen said without looking up. "He knew how to cover his tracks, and he used your father as a shield. Victor trusted him, and Alan took advantage of that trust. But now," she held up a sheet of paper triumphantly, "now we have this." Liam leaned in to see what she was holding. It was a wire transfer receipt, one of the many they had found, but this one was different. The recipient's name wasn't obscured by a shell company or a fake entity. It was Alan Grant, plain as day, and the date on the receipt: 2 days before his mother's death. Liam's stomach turned. This was it. Proof that Alan had been directly involved in the events leading up to her accident. "We have to show this to my dad," he said, his voice shaking. "He needs to see this." Karen hesitated, her expression guarded. "Liam, if we show this to Victor, he'll go straight to the lawyers. He'll try to use it in court, and Alan will see it coming. We need to be strategic." Liam glared at her, his anger bubbling to the surface. "Strategic? My mom is dead because of this man. You want me to sit here and be patient while he walks free? I want you to win." Karen shot back, her voice sharp. "If we rush this, Alan will bury us. He's already tried once. Do you really think he won't try again?" Liam fell silent, his fists clenching at his sides. He hated that she was right. Every instinct in him screamed to act, to confront Alan directly, but he couldn't afford to let his emotions cloud his judgment. Not now. The sound of a car pulling into the lot outside snapped them both to attention. Karen moved to the window, peeking out through the curtains. Her face paled. "It's them." Liam's heart stopped. "Who?" "The guys from the storage unit," she whispered. "They must have followed us." Panic surged through him as Karen began gathering the documents, shoving them back into the bag. "We need to get out of here," she said urgently. "Now." Liam grabbed the bag and followed her out the back door, the night air cold against his skin. They slipped into the shadows, moving as quickly and quietly as they could. The men outside were searching the parking lot, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like knives. Liam's pulse thundered in his ears as they crept toward the edge of the lot, every step feeling like a gamble. When they finally reached the tree line, Karen turned to him, her face grim. "This isn't over," she said. "Alan knows we're on to him. He won't stop until he's destroyed everything." Liam nodded, his jaw set. "Neither will I." As they disappeared into the woods, Liam felt a strange sense of clarity. The fight ahead would be brutal, but for the first time in years, he knew exactly what he was fighting for. His mother, his father, the truth. The city courthouse was a fortress of tension that morning, its walls buzzing with the weight of what was to come. The trial had reached its final stages, and the prosecution was preparing to present its last arguments. Reporters swarmed outside, cameras flashing as they documented every movement of the key players. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. Every seat in the gallery was filled, and Victor Ellsworth sat at the defense table, his face unreadable, but his posture betrayed the burden of months of accusations and public scrutiny. Liam wasn't in the gallery this time. He had spent the last night with Karen in a desperate race against time, combing through the documents they had recovered from the storage unit. Each page, each transaction, each cryptic note was another thread in the web Alan Grant had spun. By morning, they had pieced together a narrative that was damning not just for Alan, but for the broader network of corruption he had orchestrated. It was bigger than Liam had imagined, much bigger. And now, with evidence in hand, he was about to take the biggest gamble of his life. The courtroom doors swung open as Liam strode in, a black messenger bag slung over his shoulder. The sudden movement caught everyone's attention, and a murmur rippled through the room as people recognized Victor's son. Victor turned, his expression flickering with surprise and concern. Liam met his father's gaze for only a moment before walking past him, straight toward the defense attorney. The older man, a seasoned litigator named Carter Walsh, raised an eyebrow in silent question. "I have something you need to see," Liam whispered, sliding into the seat beside him. He opened the bag, pulling out a folder stuffed with documents. "This is everything. It's enough to clear him." Walsh flipped through the pages quickly, his sharp eyes scanning the lines with growing intensity. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice low. "It doesn't matter," Liam replied. "What matters is that it proves Alan Grant was behind all of this. The offshore accounts, the stolen money he's been using the foundation as a front for years. And my mother, she knew. She tried to stop him, and he made sure she couldn't." Walsh's expression darkened. "If this is real, it changes everything. But presenting it now will be risky. The prosecution will argue it's been tampered with." Liam shook his head. "It's not just documents. There's a recording too, proof that Alan threatened her. Play it. Let the court hear the truth." Before Walsh could respond, the judge's gavel struck sharply, calling the room to order. The prosecution was preparing to call its final witness, and the courtroom fell into silence. Alan Grant walked confidently to the stand, his tailored suit and calm demeanor painting the picture of a reliable, respectable man. Liam's stomach churned as he watched Alan raise his right hand and swear to tell the truth. He knew the lies were about to begin. "Mr. Grant," the prosecutor began, "you worked closely with Victor Ellsworth at the Ellsworth Foundation, correct?" "Yes," Alan replied smoothly. "I served as his financial advisor for over a decade. And in that time, did you ever observe Mr. Ellsworth engaging in questionable financial practices?" Alan nodded solemnly. "On multiple occasions. Victor often approved transactions without proper oversight, funneling large sums of money to accounts that couldn't be traced. When I confronted him about it, he dismissed my concerns." The prosecutor nodded, turning to the jury. "Thank you, Mr. Grant. Your testimony confirms what we've suspected all along, that Victor Ellsworth used his foundation not to help others, but to enrich himself. No further questions." As the prosecutor sat down, Walsh rose from his seat. His movements were deliberate, his expression cool. "Mr. Grant," he began, "you've painted quite the picture of my client as a reckless, self-serving man. But I'd like to ask you about your own role at the foundation. Specifically, about these." He held up the folder Liam had given him. Alan's composure faltered for a fraction of a second, but he recovered quickly. I'm not sure what you're referring to. Oh, I think you are, Walsh said, his voice calm but cutting. These are financial records from the Ellsworth Foundation records that show a pattern of embezzlement spanning years. And they don't lead back to Victor Ellsworth. They lead to you. A gasp rippled through the gallery as Walsh handed the documents to the judge. Allen's confident mask began to crack. This is absurd, he said, his voice rising. Those records could have been fabricated. That's an interesting claim, Walsh replied, his tone sharp. Because these documents include wire transfers to offshore accounts under your name. Here's the best part. One of those transfers was made 2 days before Helena Ellsworth's death. Care to explain that? Allen's face paled. I don't have to explain anything. This is a blatant attempt to discredit me. Walsh nodded as if expecting the response. Fortunately, we have more than just documents. We have a recording of you threatening Helena Ellsworth, warning her to stop digging into the Foundation's finances. Shall I play it for the court? The room erupted into chaos. The judge's gavel slammed repeatedly as reporters whispered furiously into their phones. Allen stammered, his calm facade completely. You can't use that. It's inadmissible. Actually, Walsh said, a small smile forming on his lips, it's entirely admissible. Let's hear it. The recording played, the courtroom falling into a tense silence as Allen's voice filled the room. The threat was unmistakable, dripping with malice. If Helena keeps digging, she'll regret it. Victor can't protect her forever. Liam watched Allen closely, his heart pounding as the man squirmed under the weight of his own words. This was it, the moment of truth. When the recording ended, Walsh turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the man who betrayed Victor Ellsworth, who stole millions from a charity designed to help veterans. And when Helena Ellsworth uncovered his crimes, he silenced her. Not Victor. Allen Grant. The courtroom exploded again, but Liam barely heard it. He was too busy watching Allen's reaction, the way his shoulders sagged and his hands clenched into fists. For the first time, the man looked truly afraid. The judge called for order and dismissed the jury to deliberate. As the courtroom emptied, Liam felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Victor, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and regret. You did it, Victor said softly. You saved me. Liam shook his head. I didn't do it for you. I did it for her. Victor nodded, understanding. She would have been proud of you. For the first time in years, Liam felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time, hope. It wasn't a reconciliation, not yet, but it was a start. The courthouse was thick with silence, the kind that amplifies every sound: the shuffle of papers, the tapping of a shoe, the faint cough of someone in the gallery. All eyes were on the jury as they filed back into the room, their expressions carefully neutral. The weight of the moment hung heavily in the air, pressing down on everyone present. Victor Ellsworth sat at the defense table, his hands resting on the polished wood in front of him, but his fingers betrayed the tension he felt. Liam sat in the gallery, his breath caught in his throat. He told himself it didn't matter what the verdict was, that he knew the truth about his father now, but the reality of the moment still clawed at him. The judge asked the foreperson if the jury had reached a verdict, and the foreperson rose, holding the slip of paper with steady hands. Liam's heart pounded, each second stretching unbearably as the foreperson began to speak. In the matter of the state versus Victor Ellsworth, on the charge of fraud, we find the defendant not guilty. On the charge of embezzlement, we find the defendant not guilty. For a moment, the words didn't register. Then the courtroom erupted, a cacophony of gasps, murmurs, and shouts as reporters scrambled to capture the moment. Victor exhaled deeply, his hands unclenching as he closed his eyes briefly, his composure cracking for just a moment. Liam felt relief flood through him, but it wasn't as simple as joy. The verdict didn't erase the years of pain, the loss of his mother, or the distance that had grown between him and his father. It wasn't the end of their story, just a step forward. Victor turned in his seat, his gaze searching for Liam's in the crowd. For a long moment their eyes met. There was something in his father's expression, gratitude, yes, but also something deeper, something that resembled hope. But Liam didn't move. He stayed seated, watching as Victor was pulled into a flurry of handshakes and congratulations. The reporters descended, their microphones aimed like weapons as they shouted questions, but Victor's attention lingered on Liam, even as he was escorted out of the room. Liam stayed behind as the courtroom emptied, unsure why he felt so heavy. His father was free. Alan Grant's web of lies was unraveling. And yet the knot in his chest remained, tightening as the echoes of the trial faded into the distance. He rose slowly, walking out into the cold afternoon air where the media frenzy had spilled onto the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed, voices yelled over one another, but Liam ignored them, slipping into the crowd and away from the chaos. That night, Liam returned to the Ellsworth estate for the first time in months. The house felt cavernous and empty, its grandeur muted in the dim light of the evening. He wandered aimlessly through the halls, his footsteps echoing against the marble floors. His mother's presence was everywhere and nowhere, a ghost that lingered in the scent of lavender, in the carefully arranged books on the shelves, in the faint indentations of her favorite chair in the library. Liam paused in front of the bookshelf, his fingers brushing against the spines of her favorite novels. He pulled one down, a book she used to read to him when he was a child. As he flipped through its pages, a folded piece of paper slipped out, fluttering to the floor. Frowning, he picked it up and unfolded it, his breath catching as he recognized his mother's handwriting. The note was brief but unmistakably hers. "My dearest Liam, if you're reading this, it means you've had to face things I hoped you never would. But I want you to know how proud I am of you, of your strength, your compassion, and your courage. Never lose sight of who you are, and never stop fighting for what's right. All my love, Mom." Liam sank into the nearest chair, the note trembling in his hands. Tears blurred his vision as he read and reread the words, her voice echoing in his mind. For so long he had carried the weight of her absence like a stone in his chest, letting it harden into anger and bitterness. But now, reading her words, he felt something crack open. She had believed in him. Even in her absence, she had left him a piece of herself, a reminder of the person she had always hoped he would be. He didn't hear the footsteps at first, but when he looked up, he saw Victor standing in the doorway of the library. His father's face was lined with exhaustion, but his eyes were steady as they met Liam's. "She would have been proud of you," Victor said softly, his voice breaking the silence. Liam set the note down carefully, his expression unreadable. "She would have been proud of both of us." Eventually, Victor stepped into the room, hesitating before sitting in the chair across from him. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Victor leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. "I know I can't change the past," he said quietly. "And I know I've made mistakes more than I can count. But I want to try to make things right, if you'll let me." Liam didn't respond immediately. He looked down at the note again, running his fingers over the words. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. "I don't know if I can forgive you. Not yet. But maybe I can try." Victor nodded, his expression somber. "That's all I can ask for." In the weeks that followed, the fallout from the trial rippled through the city. Alan Grant was arrested on charges of embezzlement, fraud, and evidence tampering. His network of corruption unraveled quickly, implicating several other high-profile figures in one of the biggest scandals the city had ever seen. Victor, though exonerated, chose not to return to the Ellsworth Foundation. Instead, he announced its dissolution, with the remaining assets donated to independent charities dedicated to helping veterans and their families. Liam, meanwhile, found himself at a crossroads. For so long he had defined himself by his anger, by his conviction that he was nothing like his father. But with the truth laid bare, he wasn't sure who he was anymore. He began volunteering at one of the charities his father had funded, finding solace in the work his mother had believed in so deeply. Months later, Liam stood on a stage in front of a small crowd. They were gathered for the opening of a new community center for veterans, funded in part by the remnants of the Ellsworth Foundation. The center was named after Helena, a tribute to the woman who had fought so hard for what she believed in. As Liam spoke about his mother's legacy, about the importance of accountability and compassion, he saw Victor in the crowd. His father sat quietly in the front row, his face solemn but proud. For the first time in years, Liam felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time: hope. When the ceremony ended, Victor approached him, his steps slow but steady. He stopped a few feet away, his hands in his pockets. "You did a good thing today," Victor said simply. "So did you," Liam replied. Victor hesitated, then extended a hand. Liam looked at it for a moment before shaking it firmly. It wasn't an embrace, and it wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. And for now, it was enough.